Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Caroline Kendi-Robb. I'm the Executive Director of the Africa Progress Panel. We are delighted to have with us today a very distinguished panel, and I'm honoured to welcome Mr. Cyril Ramaphosa. He is a Deputy President of South Africa. Mr. Colin Dyer. He is the CEO and President of JLL. Ms. Dana Hyde. She is the CEO of the Millennium Challenge Corporation. And Mr. John Rice, who is the Vice Chair of GE. The topic of our session today is infrastructure investment. And our overriding question is, how can innovative partnerships bridge financing gaps for economic and social infrastructure? So I think over the last day and a half, we've certainly heard a lot of discussion about Africa kind of being at a crossroads. We see that we've got a lot of economic growth, it's taken root, exports are booming, foreign investment is on the rise, dependence on aid is declining. Governance reforms are transforming the political landscape. Democracy, transparency, and accountability have improved. But at the same time, we're also hearing a different narrative, as it were. And I think for many African governments, we can see that they are failing to a certain extent to really transform the growth, to transform the benefits of the commodity supercycle into benefits that affect all Africans. Now, as a consequence of this, we can see that inequality is increasing in many countries. Poverty is not falling as fast as it should, and Africa's share of global malnutrition and child deaths is increasing. But what our panel are going to discuss here today are also the incredible opportunities across Africa. So of course, this economic growth, this population growth is creating huge demand for infrastructure. Trade opportunities are expanding, business environment is improving, and the G8 and the G20 countries have identified African infrastructure financing as a priority. So during this session, we'll look at issues related to the perception of risk in Africa. And I've heard that so much over the last day and a half. I mean, what do we really mean by that? What do we really mean by blended finance for public infrastructure? And finally, how can we weave in a sustainability argument into this? So with that, I'd like to turn to our first panelist, Mr. Ramaphosa. And I would really like you to share with us, sir, what kinds of infrastructure projects are you doing in South Africa to ensure that we can stimulate the growth, but at the same time reduce inequality? And linked to that, given the funding constraints and the political needs, how do you prioritize your infrastructure projects?
Thank you very much. Thank you to be here, to have this opportunity, particularly to share a little bit about what the journey that we have traversed as South Africa. And our story really starts some 21 years ago when we became a democracy. Prior to that, the infrastructure configuration in our country was more aligned to benefit a minority of minorities in our country. Whatever roads there were, whatever housing, water reticulation, electricity, was more concentrated towards favoring a minority. When the democratic government got into office, it suddenly realized that it had a huge burden of now addressing the lack of infrastructure for the majority of the people of South Africa. It got underway to do precisely that. So infrastructure development then started. And along the way, we developed a plan which we call the National Development Plan, which focuses on infrastructure, that if you want to really generate growth in your economy, you should focus on developing infrastructure, but do it on a much more focused way. And because infrastructure development was happening in bits and pieces all over the place, we felt the need to coordinate and set up what we call the Presidential Infrastructure Coordination Council. That then pulled together all infrastructure projects into one hub. And we had a secretariat that had a radar view on all infrastructure projects and the money that was being spent, the investment that was going in, and the type of infrastructure. And we decided to focus on infrastructure, both types, social infrastructure, as well as, if you like, economic infrastructure, which would be in roads and stuff like that. But social infrastructure involved houses, rolling out electricity to the majority of our people, building dams so that there can be water reticulation and all that. And the coordination effect has paid great dividends, and this is what one would like to put out as a case study, that if you coordinate and have everything that has to do with infrastructure in an office, coordinated at the top level of government, reported to the cabinet on an ongoing basis, you're almost half the way towards winning the infrastructure backlog route. But of course, finance has to be the other important aspect of this. Now, of course, our government got into debt, raised quite a bit of debt to improve infrastructure, but it has paid great dividends because it has improved the livelihood of millions of people, just taking housing. In 21 years, we've built 4.3 million houses. We've electrified almost 20 million houses in South Africa, whereas in the past, the numbers were very, very poor. And service delivery, improving the lives of people and lifting them from poverty has been a key product or dividend that we have had. It's also generated economic activity and also created some jobs, not enough jobs as to be able to stem the huge backlog that we have in relation to creating jobs. But on the financing side, we then decided to come up with innovative ways of partnering with the private sector, particularly in energy and electricity. We ran into headwinds with our energy reticulation or generation. We neglected maintaining some of our power stations for quite a while, and that caught up with us and we ran into problems. But the private sector came as independent power producers who were able to sell the energy they produce to the grid, to the national grid. Now, that opened a new window of opportunity for economic development, which has other benefits at a community level, where the private sector came and said, we have this area in your country which has a lot of wind, which has a lot of sun. We want to catch the wind, we want to catch the sun, and we developed policy to enable them to do so. And in doing so, we decided that quite a lot of the components they will use must be localized. They must be locally made. That help to develop other industries in the country, and the communities where those stations, those power stations were built also became part of the whole developmental mix that started to happen. Infrastructure has been a key economic driver in our country, and we would greatly recommend investors to keep flowing to South Africa because there's money to be made in South African infrastructure, and indeed, I would say African infrastructure. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I just actually, please. I just want a quick follow-up question at the point that you raised right at the end, and that's what could South Africa's role be with regards to promoting better regional infrastructure projects?
Well, our president has been asked by the AU to be the coordinator of infrastructure development on the continent. And indeed, in the southern part of the country, there's quite a lot of cooperation that is happening in opening up infrastructure facilities that will lead to increased trade when it comes to energy as well. So we are doing quite a lot and intend to do much more. Infrastructure is better approached when it is done at a regional level as well, because our countries are interlinked, particularly when it comes to people movement and trade. And as it is, South Africa gets quite a lot of its water from Lesotho. So part of our infrastructure development has had to be done in another country in the sub-region. And in doing so, it has benefited Lesotho quite a lot. So has it benefited South Africans. It's about to benefit Botswana as well. And that is a mutually beneficial type of infrastructure rollout, which we support very much. So we are all up for infrastructure development that is all-encompassing because it's mutually beneficial and it leads to economic development. And the dividend that we all earn when it comes to that in terms of employment, economic activity is quite huge, and that's what we should focus on.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Dyer, I have a question for you now. I understand that you work a lot in real estate. I wondered if you could just share with us how real estate links to infrastructure, power, urban development. Just share with us some of your thoughts on that. And then if you could just help explain to us, and this is a discussion that many people have had, why risk is perceived as very high for Africa. Is there something about the narrative that people are sharing internationally that's not truly reflective of what's going on in Africa?
Right. Well, to those of you who don't know our company, we advise on real estate services, all aspects of real estate from investment by sovereign wealth funds right through to your individual company's need for space in Lagos. And we do that globally in 70 countries. So we have a very good view of the continuum between the very highly developed West European, US countries, right through to the more challenged areas of Asia and Africa. And so we can see some trends and similarities across various different economies at the various stages of their development. Real estate, infrastructure, and the urban environment are all inextricably linked together. You can build physical infrastructure, but unless you have buildings and a quality urban environment to attract people and companies and begin this process of creativity and wealth creation that happens when you urbanize, as much of Africa is just in the process of beginning, really. That's what creates long-term wealth. That's what creates, to Mr. Ramaphosa's point, profits for companies, for indigenous as well as international companies. So to us, as real estate professionals, experts and advisors globally, the quality of the urban environment and the quality of its infrastructure are all inextricably linked. So from the area of our expertise, which is real estate development and financing, and how does that happen in developing countries, just a single number for you. Last year, sort of investment quality real estate traded globally was about $700 billion. Half of that is cross-border investment. Less than 10 billion came into the entire African continent, and most of that went into two countries, which are Nigeria and South Africa. So there is indeed a disproportionately small amount of international capital flowing into Africa. From McKinsey's number this morning, across the broad sector of commercial investment across all sectors, less than 4% is flowing into Africa. So there's clearly a big deficit in investment. Why is it that foreign direct investment, international investment is so important to Africa? It's obvious, really, but we've seen it in China, Indonesia, India, as they've gone through their cycles of development. When domestic capital markets are shallow, not reliable, and certainly not available to provide capital on the medium and long term, you simply are obliged as countries to attract international capital. How do you do that? Whether it's equity or debt, how do you do that in the period before domestic capital markets become mature and deep enough to be able to fund domestically? You have to create an environment which international capital finds acceptable. And this is where we come to the point of perceived risk. In the real estate world, investors need transparency of information about costs and returns and the initial and the ultimate purchase and sale price of real estate and the lease price of that real estate to do commercial underwriting for their transactions. So they need data and transparency of information. They need reliable judicial systems. You'll only attract money if it can be sure it'll be fairly dealt with and if it can be sure that it will be able to retain ownership of the asset that it's purchased through the life cycle and beyond to sale. International capital is looking for low levels of bureaucracy and reducing levels of bureaucracy in order to be able to deal in an efficient and simple way. And a good example of that, by the way, is here in Rwanda, the only country we know where you can actually establish a company online. Maybe Mr. Ramaphosa will contradict that. So low levels of bureaucracy, and finally, obviously, low levels of corruption. And if you take those four things together, transparency of data, judicial systems, low levels of bureaucracy, and low levels of corruption, that's the challenge for many African nations. And I thought the point you made, sir, about if you can deal with things in a coordinated way, almost in one room, but at least in one program around those elements of transparency, that's the way you move the attractiveness of a country forward.
I'd like to move to Ms. Hyde now. I understand you got back from Malawi, and you were working on helping the government reform the power utility to make it creditworthy partner for independent power producers. And I think the utilities are actually worldwide, it's hugely challenging to get a fully functional, effective utility. But just relating it back to what Mr. Dyer was saying about issues of transparency and all these other issues, which are vital for utilities. I wondered if you could share with us some of your experiences on reforming the utilities.
Thank you. So, as many of you know, the Millennium Challenge Corporation is a different type of U.S. development agency. It was founded relatively new, the new kid on the block, just 12 years ago, and founded on many of the principles that the panelists here are espousing. It's different in a couple of key ways. First of all, it is competitive grants for countries that are meeting indicators, transparent, objective indicators around economic freedoms and governance and the degree to which they invest their resources in their people. And it is truly based on a very partner country-led design and implementation of our program. And the grants themselves are 5-year instruments. They average roughly $350 million, although they have ranged from 70 to 700 million. And it is a very strict 5-year clock for implementation, so the money will evaporate at that point. Over the course of the decade, MCC has signed 19 compacts with 15 African countries. We've invested roughly 65% of the portfolio here in Africa, so $6.5 billion. And importantly, 70% of that has been invested in infrastructure, so roads, bridges, and increasingly energy infrastructure. MCC is just initiating its second generation of compacts. 4 of the last 5 that we have brought to the board have been solely focused in energy, and they have represented more than $1 billion in grant assistance. So increasingly, MCC is looking at the energy sector and looking at what is often the public good in the energy sector, which is the utility, and focusing our resources and our expertise on turning around the utility to make it a credit-worthy off-taker of private IPPs, PPAs, and obviously the large amount of private capital that's going into generation. There are a number of countries where this is the case. I would say Malawi was one of our first partnerships where we're focused there. The compact in Malawi is $350 million. As many of you know, less than 10% of the country is connected to the grid in Malawi. And the utility, Eskom, the other Eskom, is our key partner. We're doing a number of things. We have done and supported a forensic audit. We've updated all of the IT systems. Most importantly, we've done an assessment of the tariff structure. There have been incremental rises in the tariff. I think we have a bit to go there. There are a number of technical advisors that we're supporting in the utility. And during my visit there, we learned that Malawi is just about to sign its first ever PPA, and that the plan for the next year would be to move the utility into the black. So we see this as critical in addition to the actual substations and the like that we are building there. The investment in the utility to turn it around, because of MCC's approach, which is also unique. The Deputy President spoke of coordination. That commitment to country-led implementation means that there is a coordination unit that is housed in the in the President's office, or related to the Finance Ministry. And that coordination unit is what is driving this program. So the political will is at that level of the investment.
Thank you. Mr. Rice, I just want to give you a quote from President Adesina of the African Development Bank. And he says, "Africa is simply tired of being kept in the dark." So huge opportunity, 621 million Africans without access to electricity. And I think over the last year and a half, we can see immense political momentum to do something about this challenge, but this opportunity. And there's lots of new partnerships that are emerging. Power Africa is one of them, and many others. I wonder if you could share with us some of the things that you see are very positive, but yet some of the challenges too related to this momentum and these partnerships.
Well, first of all, I think Africa should be tired of being kept in the dark. But it's not just Africa. There's 1.5 billion people in the world that lack adequate access to electricity, and more than a third live in Africa. So this is a concentrated part of the problem, but it's not the only problem. And we live in a world where increasingly people are fed up with that, because they know that if you want to achieve this aspiration we call sustainable inclusive growth, where people have a chance to have a better life than their parents and their kids have a better life than they do, it's impossible to have without electricity. You need a few other things too, but if you don't have electricity, it's all empty talk. And there have been some very good initiatives contemplated, Power Africa being one of them. But if you look today at the number of megawatts that are actually on the grid directly related to the Power Africa initiative, it's very little. And there's a lot of factors that go into that, but I think the first thing we have to do is understand why, because that was a well-intentioned effort with a lot of smart people, a lot of willing participants, financial institutions, and yet for some reason it couldn't come together. I think there's a number of factors, two of which I'll talk about today. One is finance. You know, everybody says that they'll put capital into these projects, and then we define risk in our traditional old school ways. And so if you don't get capital to these power projects, they're not going to happen. So we have to think differently about how we assess risk. I think governments and bureaucracies have to act differently. Very few are paid to go fast, because they think if they go fast, they're going to be accused of being corrupt. I think the point that the Deputy President made about having a coordinating structure for infrastructure makes a lot of sense, because the decisions get sucked up into short-term political expediency and grind to a halt. We're working on an emergency power project in Ghana that has taken us 16 months to get to the purchase price agreement approval by Parliament. That's an emergency power project. So I don't know how long it would take if it wasn't an emergency. And so we have to condition governments and bureaucracies to be ready to move, to push these projects forward, or they're going to languish. And that contributes to the absence of power connected with Power Africa. And then the last point I'd make, and this directly related to the Deputy President's point, is the ability to balance short-term and long-term. You know, we live in a world where increasingly the cycle is around the next election. And when you're talking about infrastructure investments and power projects, you got to have the ability to get way past the next election. And if you don't, those projects probably aren't going to happen.
I'm going to ask Ms. Hyde to comment on the Power Africa, but before I do that, I just have a quick follow-up question for you. and it's related to the incredible momentum from COP21. And, across Africa, we can see there's so many energy entrepreneurs is a term that I've heard. And I'm just wondering how GE is thinking about ways in bringing in the energy entrepreneurs, bringing in the innovators, bringing in the emerging African scientists into this space, into this energy space. Are you working with any at that level to really capitalize on this incredible momentum and opportunity?
We work with all of them, and we have a broad array of technologies in renewables and all sorts of power generating technologies that use fossil fuels more efficiently. But I also think it's important not to forget, notwithstanding COP21, that there's a lot of countries in the world that don't work without coal. So you can't kind of forget about coal. We all have a responsibility to figure out how to use it in a more environmentally responsible way. So clean coal technologies, we do care about the environment, we do care about global warming, but we can't pretend that COP21 gives us the opportunity to forget about coal, because probably 40% of the world's population live in countries where without coal, those economies don't work.
Yeah, and I'd like to underline that point, because Africa's global carbon footprint is 2.3% without South Africa, so it's tiny. So African countries should be able to have the energy mix which is appropriate for their own development. So I would very much support that. So Ms. Hyde, please, if you could share with us the Power Africa.
So I think John's making very good points about the time horizon, and I think that's really the prism through which we should evaluate and look at the Power Africa initiative. There is a robust pipeline. I think results are not coming in terms of closing deals as quickly yet, but I see a great reason for optimism over the next year. I mean, I think I have never seen such alignment, not just among the U.S. Donors and private sector, but in the international community around this set of objectives. And I think that, we've seen certainly in the health sector, when there is that concentration of attention around a need and that consensus, which I think Power Africa has really helped build. We were speaking earlier about the predicate for development in so many ways is energy. And I think there's really a recognition of that, and that Power Africa, by bringing the private sector and the donor community and the multilaterals, all of the various capital streams together, we will get there. The other good news I would say is that recently, in terms of longevity, the United States Congress passed the Electrify Africa bill, which is an effort to codify and not make this a flash in the pan effort, but to say we're behind bringing power and energy across the continent for all of the reasons that we've talked about throughout the week, and I think we'll go forward strongly.